Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tracing the truly dramatic rise and fall of an empire that literally redrew the map of the world. We are talking about a story of unprecedented ambition, staggering wealth, and, as we'll see, devastating human costs that completely transformed global history. Just think about this for a second. What if one single empire controlled territories across 4 continents? Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa. What if it connected oceans that were thousands of miles apart, way before the invention of the steam engine or the telegraph? Well, at its height, the Spanish Empire did exactly that. It was an absolute behemoth, transforming global trade and spreading its culture across the globe. But how on earth did they build this massive network? And maybe more importantly, why did it all eventually collapse? Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for tracing this classic Icarus narrative, from unprecedented ambition to its eventual collapse. We'll hit forging the empire, the silver engine, the golden age, the slow collapse, and finally, a complicated legacy. Part 1. Forging the empire, the spark and the sword. The foundational spark for all of this actually hits in the late 15th century, specifically the 1492 conquest of Granada by Ferdinand and Isabella. That very same year, 1492, Christopher Columbus sails west across the Atlantic, and by reaching the Caribbean, he triggers an unbelievably rapid era of expansion. It's actually staggering how fast this happened. In just a few decades into the early 16th century, you have Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro leading campaigns that toppled the powerful, massive Aztec and Inca empires. In just a blink of an eye, historically speaking, Spanish forces captured enormous territories across Central and South America. But we absolutely have to look at the human cost here, because that incredibly rapid expansion came with a catastrophic toll. The conquest unleashed severe warfare, systemic forced labor, and widespread displacement upon indigenous peoples. And most destructively, the arrival of Europeans brought new diseases where there was very little immunity. This resulted in a massive demographic catastrophe, which stands in sharp contrast to the triumphant narrative of the empire's explosive growth. Moving to part 2, the silver engine. The global engine. Because if the sword conquered the territory, it was immense wealth, specifically enormous deposits of American silver and gold, that truly fueled this empire. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how that wealth created one of the world's very first global trade networks. Check this out. Step 1. The silver is extracted from massive mines, like Potosí and Zacatecas. Step 2. It's shipped to coastal ports like Acapulco. Then, step 3, it is loaded onto the famous Manila galleons and shipped all the way across the Pacific to the Philippines to trade for Asian goods. For more than 2 centuries, this exact geographic flow directly linked the Atlantic and Pacific worlds, a true global engine. Which brings us to part 3, the Golden Age, the zenith. We're talking the 16th and early 17th centuries here, representing the absolute peak of Spanish cultural and political might. All that immense wealth pouring in from the colonies, it catalyzed a dazzling cultural explosion back home. This is the era when Miguel de Cervantes is writing Don Quixote. Influential Spanish painters, architects, and poets are actively shaping the rest of European culture. And backed by all this wealth, King Philip II is wielding just enormous military and political influence on the world stage. In fact, in 1580, Philip II achieves a temporary Iberian dynastic union, bringing the massive Portuguese overseas empire under the Spanish monarch. This brief union really represented the absolute pinnacle of their geopolitical power. They had their hands in everything. But, as history constantly reminds us, the absolute top is exactly where the stage is set for a dramatic turning point. Let's move to part 4 and see how this builds into the slow collapse, the unraveling. Because keeping a planetary empire together is, well, it's nearly impossible. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the massive economic paradox it shows. On the left, you have seemingly limitless silver wealth flowing in from the Americas, but on the right, crushing debt and inflation. It turns out that American silver was kind of a poison chalice. By becoming so entirely dependent on that silver to fund endless wars rather than investing it into domestic industries, the sheer volume of silver flooding the European market severely devalued their own currency. They literally spent themselves into financial ruin. Compounding that internal financial ruin were immense external pressures. Endless wars really drained the empire. In 1588, the famous Spanish Armada fails completely in its invasion of England. Then, the Dutch Republic fights for its independence and builds its own fierce rival empire. And, with France and England growing increasingly powerful, well, these rivalries just rapidly drained Spain's already strained resources and put immense pressure on the monarchy. But the real rapid unraveling of their American territories kicks off in 1808. Napoleon invades Spain, triggering massive political instability back in Europe. And that instability, it was the spark for the colonies. Independence movements spread like wildfire. You have brilliant leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín emerging, leading struggles that were so successful, by the mid-19th century, Spain had lost almost all of its mainland American colonies. Which brings us to this single, stark date, 1898. You can basically look at this year as a visual tombstone for the empire. Following a decisive defeat by the United States in the Spanish-American War, Spain lost its final major overseas possessions: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Just like that, centuries of global dominance essentially ended. So that brings us to part 5, a complicated legacy, because while the physical political empire disappeared, its massive global footprint remains heavily embedded across multiple continents today. So the crucial point is that we are left with a deeply complex, two-sided legacy. It's a true dual legacy. On one side, we see the global adoption of the Spanish language, beautiful architecture, religion, and food embedded across dozens of modern nations. But on the exact same coin, we have to neutrally recognize the severe violence, forced labor, and exploitation that built it. The empire caused deep cultural disruption and a profound demographic catastrophe for indigenous peoples. It is a legacy defined equally by cultural proliferation and profound human tragedy. So, I'll leave you with this. How do the echoes of this fallen empire still shape the borders, languages, and identities of our world today? It's wild to think that when you look at a modern map or hear the languages spoken from the Americas all the way to parts of Asia, you are directly experiencing the aftermath of the 400-year history we just explored together. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If you enjoyed diving into this with us, please like, subscribe, and continue learning as we keep unpacking the fascinating stories that built our world. See you next time.